Hello, I'm Matt Lowndes, and welcome to the All-In Affordable Housing Show here at LTV. Today, I am honored to be joined by Assemblyman Fred Thiele, who has been working in politics since 1975, I believe. No, 1975 or 79, sorry. He started working for John Behan of Montauk as legal counsel and has worked his way up and around, all around Southampton, East Hampton. Mr. Assemblyman, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Hey, Matt, it's good to see you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and we want to jump right in this. We were talking a little bit before I started recording here, and there's a lot of different things going on with affordable housing. I've talked to whether it be East Hampton Town board members to local friends that I have who have had situations. But today I really want to get involved in two things that you're really passionate about. And we're going to start off with today the Community Preservation Fund and the Community Housing Fund that you have pushed for the last 20 years. The one thing I will no doubt say is that this is very hard to understand from a normal citizen who may not understand where this money comes from, how the tax works. So could you dumb it down for me and for the viewers, because I really want people to understand what's going to be on the 2023 referendum?
Sure. Well, let me start with the Community Preservation Fund, because that's the existing fund that we have for land preservation and water quality protection. And that has been in existence since 1998. Wow. So for well over we're coming up on 25 years.
Almost my whole life. I just turned 25.
Yeah, almost your whole life. So, and the purpose of that fund was, going back to 1998 was the region was under incredible development pressure. People on the East End were afraid we might just become just another suburb, like up in Western Suffolk or Nassau County. And we wanted to protect the resources that we had that made the East End special. Things like farmland preservation, open spaces, parks, recreation, historic preservation. So this was a dedicated fund that was initially only for land. It was to preserve environmentally sensitive lands. Later, it was expanded to allow us to use it for a portion of it, 20% for water quality projects. But the first thing that everybody should know is that it's a dedicated fund. This fund can only be used for specific purposes, and it's land preservation and water quality projects. The second thing that people should know about it is how it's funded. It is funded by a 2% real estate transfer tax. So every time a piece of real estate gets sold, on the East End, and all 5 towns on the East End have it: East Hampton, Southampton, Shelter Island, Southold, and Riverhead. So every time a piece of real estate gets sold, there's a 2% tax on the purchase price, and that money goes into this dedicated fund. And during the pandemic last year, across the 5 towns, it generated $210 million in 2021 for land preservation. It tells you how active the real estate market is here. What is great about this fund is that it allows conservation to keep pace with development. The hotter the development is, the more pressure on our open spaces and our land, but it also generates more money. And because of that, since 1998, across the East End, we've been able to preserve about 10,000 acres of land. As I said, farmland, wetlands, pine barrens, open spaces, waterfront accesses, things of that nature, historic landmarks, land for active parks and recreation, the whole gamut. And, it's made a difference in keeping the quality of life here on the East End. And in a nutshell, that's what the Community Preservation Fund is. There's an exemption on the first $250,000 of every acquisition. We try to, when people are trying to buy a first house, we give them an exemption on the lower end to try to lower the impact there. But in a nutshell, that's the fund. It's an environmental fund to protect land and water, and it's funded by a real estate transfer tax.
Now, as we move forward, you have proposed, and it's going to be on the 2023 referendum in each town. It's based on each town coming up with its own referendum, but a community housing fund. Now, that would be an extra 0.5% tax on that, and it is my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, and in which, basically, to dumb it down, over the pandemic, all the homes that were bought, there was about $30 million worth of $30 million that would have gone into this fund, and East Hampton would have gotten $8 million if this was in place to go directly towards affordable housing. Is that correct?
Yeah, the community housing fund, the proposal, because it has to be voted on by the voters, but I call it the sister of the community preservation fund. And that is, it would be a dedicated fund, but to help with the issue of affordable housing. And I should say at the outset that, you know, affordable housing, the ability of people that work here or people that grew up here to be able to stay here in their home community, as there's been increased demand for second homes, people that want to come out here from other places, you know, maybe full-time, but maybe part-time. You know, that has driven up the price and has reduced the inventory of housing for those of us who grew up here and would like to stay here and or who work here. And so, you know, the community housing fund is designed to address, you know, that particular issue. And so that problem has gotten only worse during the pandemic. You know, more people have wanted to come out here. Prices have gone up. Inventory has gone down. But you're right. You know, I first passed this bill. It passed the state legislature for the first time in 2019. But then Governor Cuomo vetoed the bill. So if it had been in effect last year, you're correct. I mean, it would have generated actually even more than 30 million, probably closer for that year, closer to 50 million. And for East Hampton, I've got it right here. East Hampton, it probably would have generated somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe, you know, somewhere between 12 and 15 million dollars for East Hampton.
And if we're being honest, 50 million dollars, that's 2, 3, maybe 4 apartment complexes, or you could buy and put up small homes for home ownership. There's two arguments to both, but the fact of the matter is that's money East Hampton doesn't have that they could have had. Was there any specific, I mean, obviously I don't know if you were able to talk to former Governor Cuomo yourself about this, but was there any specific reasons of why this was vetoed at the time? Obviously nobody knew the pandemic was coming and that there was going to be this huge boom of home buying within the Hamptons and other areas, but was there any specific reasons then that you were told of why it wasn't passed?
Yeah, I had an opportunity to talk with the governor's office after the veto, and I think the stated reasons and the real reasons may not necessarily be the same, but you know, they stated they wanted more information, that they didn't have enough information to make a decision. I would dispute that. The kind of information they wanted to know what was the demand, the need for affordable housing, what had they already done to try to resolve the affordable housing problem, and how would this fund have helped to solve the problem. I think all that information was kind of readily available. My theory on why it didn't get signed in 2019 is that the governor, not just this bill, but a number of local tax bills were vetoed. And I think it's hard to think back to this because it was before the pandemic, but the state had a budget shortfall. We had a budget deficit at the time, and the governor was trying to send the message, we're not going to increase taxes to deal with our budget deficit. So I thought he was sending everybody a message by vetoing whatever tax bills were before him to say, I'm not going to vote for I'm not going to sign any new taxes. So I think that was what was really going on. I think it was short-sighted. You know, after all, the voters would have had to approve it anyway. We were just giving the voters the right to do it. But, you know, fast forward, you know, we deal with the pandemic. The housing situation gets worse. We have a new governor, Kathy Hochul. Governor Hochul was great in signing the bill this time, and now voters in each of the 5 towns will have the opportunity in a referendum. A couple of things have to happen first. I'll just briefly go through the steps here.
Yeah, of course,
First,
please.
yeah, the first thing that had to happen was we had to pass the state legislation. Okay, we've checked that box. It's done. The second thing that has to happen now is that the towns, each town will have to adopt its own housing plan. In essence, the housing plan would be the implementation plan. And it would, what I think is most important, because voters have to vote on it, it will tell voters in each town, if you give us this authority, if you give us this tax, we're going to tell you how we're going to spend the money. And the town has a wide range of different options that it can utilize. You mentioned some of them. You could build new housing for home ownership. You could build apartments for rental. The town could enter into public-private partnerships. It could be used to help with employee housing. It could be used for the rehabilitation of existing buildings to convert it to housing. It also could be used to provide financial assistance to first-time home buyers. So,
which is really needed out here for first-time home
that may
buyers.
be the most important thing, Matt, because things like down payment assistance or additional mortgage money that might be money that the town could provide that would be more than a bank could provide. So it's basically anything you can think of. The town will be able to use it for affordable housing to help, either by providing new housing stock or making existing housing stock more affordable. So that they need that plan first, though, to tell people of all those options, how are they going to use the money? And then the next thing they'll have to do is they have to pass a local law, creating the fund and imposing the tax. And then all of that is going to be subject to a mandatory referendum that each town will have to adopt. Now, you had mentioned 2023. I'm not sure from talking to the towns whether they're going to try to get it on the ballot in 2022 or 2023. Obviously, there's still a fair amount of work that they need to do. They have to do the plan, they have to pass the local law, and you can't underestimate the fact that they have to involve the public in this process. There have to be public hearings. There has to be public outreach. You need to, hear from the public. What do they think is important? How do they think the money should be spent? So we'll see whether or not the towns can get it done in time for a referendum in 2022, or it will be 2023. And the other thing too is, each of the towns is kind of in a slightly different place. Places like East Hampton and Southampton, particularly East Hampton, they've done a lot of work on affordable housing. They would have done more if they had this fund and they had the money to do more. But they're somewhat further along than some of the other towns are. And the North Fork is different than the South Fork, and Shelter Island is different than either fork. So they all each have to figure it out. But in a nutshell, they need to do the plan, they need to create the fund, and then they need to let the voters vote on it.
Now, I do find it ironic how Governor Cuomo, former Governor Cuomo, vetoed the bill, and then his brother comes to East Hampton after he gets fired at CNN. So I'm saying the hard part out loud. It's my show. I'm allowed to do that.
Well, let's just leave it at this. The governor made a mistake in vetoing it. I thought so at the time. And I think time has shown that, how, you're right. Nobody could have predicted the pandemic, but the need for resources to help people with housing is greater now than ever before. If he used this bill and other local tax bills to veto them, to send a message about, no new taxes on the state level, that was a poor use of his veto power. I'll just leave it at that.
Now, a few weeks ago, I had the privilege of talking to Benjamin Applebaum, a New York Times editorial board member, editorial review board member, and he gave me some great insight into the affordable housing from a national scale. Um, and if you type in affordable housing, you'll often see articles across the country from every single state. And if you put in accessory dwelling units, you see articles coming across the country in every single state, every single city. One thing I recognize from our conversation with Mr. Applebaum is that affordable housing is becoming a middle class issue. Over the last decade, we've had the least amount of homes built in this country, and it's way lower than the number we should have built. One potential solution, something that you're extremely passionate about, is what I just mentioned: accessory dwelling units. You did propose a bill that Governor Kathy Hochul did not pass. It was There was a lot of controversy about that. It was within something else. You can explain that better than I can, but explain to me your want and need for, or your want for accessory dwelling units and how it could benefit our community out here in the East End, specifically for retirees, government workers, teachers, police officers, etc.
Yeah, so you and I did the same thing. We Googled the accessory dwelling units, and there's a lot of incredible things that are going on across the country with regard to accessory dwellings in places like Connecticut and in California, in particular, in most recently. So let me start with the theory of how this would work, and that is, you take existing dwellings that already exist. And you provide the opportunity for an accessory dwelling for, basically a smaller apartment, and on the same property. They get called different things, granny flats, mother daughter, things of that nature. But basically, what you're talking about is an accessory dwelling unit. It could be within the main dwelling. It could be on an accessory building above a garage. Different properties would lead itself in different ways. So, that's an opportunity to create a lot of housing in a relatively simple way. So the question is, what's the best way to do it? And, I think, we found out maybe some, what doesn't work, and now we need to find out what does work. And, to start with, just about every local government, every town, every village on the East End, most of them have an accessory apartment law already, where you can get, you can go to, apply to the town for an accessory dwelling. But they seem these laws seem to be hardly ever used. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. One is they're very, very cumbersome. It takes time, it takes a lot of money, and they just haven't worked. So you mentioned that there was one proposal that was put forward, which would have been, to basically mandate on every local government that they would have to allow accessory apartments for every residential dwelling with, every potential residential dwelling could have one, and they were be allowed as a matter of right. And that ran into a lot of resistance because it was kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. And East Hampton is different than New York City, and Plattsburgh is different than Nassau County, and all of that. And
that makes sense.
It also took away local home rule authority, and at LTV, from covering planning board meetings and zoning board meetings.
Oh yeah.
Architectural Review Board, people like local control over land use. So the governor withdrew that proposal. But what she said was, we need to come up with a series of incentives. First, they need to be legal, but we also need incentives. If it's one thing to make them legal, but if, as I said, people aren't walking through the door to do that, we need to provide people with incentives to create these accessory dwellings.
What type of incentives are we talking about here?
Yeah, exactly. And again, if you do that Google search and you look at what other communities are doing, the incentives are multifaceted. I think the most important incentive is to provide, it's very capital intensive. You got to come up with money up front, and it's not cheap to build an accessory apartments.
Well, Sorry for interrupting, but my understanding is a lot of what would stop a normal everyday citizen from creating an accessory dwelling unit is their septic tank.
That is, you're right, especially in a place like Suffolk County where we get our drinking water from our groundwater. We have very strict rules for septic systems now, and new requirements for so-called IA systems. They all cost money. So one of the things is to provide grant funding to, in exchange for providing an affordable accessory apartment and building one, grant funding. And depending on the community, grants of $50,000 or $75,000 would be a great incentive to get people to, not just to build an accessory apartment, but to build one legally. So number one is grant funding. And when I've looked, the communities that have had the most success in getting accessory apartments done, grant funding would be a way to do that. Now, part of this community housing fund could be used for that, but I think that there should be a state program statewide that would provide grant funding. The other types of incentives would be some sort of tax break. One of the fears that people have of going to create an accessory apartment is they're going to go get a permit from the town. They're going to build an accessory apartment, and the next thing that's going to happen is the tax assessor is going to show up and reassess their property and increase the property tax. So one of the things we're looking at would be to exempt the increased value that would come from an accessory apartment from any taxes. So if building the accessory apartment increased the value of your house and your tax bill, we would exempt the portion that would be contributed by the accessory apartment.
That's a nice benefit.
A property tax benefit. The other thing that we would look at also is we want people to rent these things at less than market value to make them affordable. So we would also want to provide an income tax credit against your income tax. The difference between the market value of rent and the affordable rent that you're offering. I'm going to use an example, but say the market rent was $2,000 and what was affordable was $1,500. You could get a tax credit against your income tax of $500 for the difference.
Now, if you don't mind me interjecting, one common theme I hear specifically in our community, East Hampton, Sag Harbor, Springs, etc., is there's nowhere for local government workers to live, and they have to commute from Riverhead, and same with teachers and police officers. Is it legal via the accessory dwelling units to say if you rent to a police officer, a teacher, a government worker, we can give you a tax credit back, etc. So that is that legal or is that illegal?
It's not. Well, it's neither. It's just not permitted by the law now. We would, one of the things that, I'm going to give you a little news here. But we're going to introduce this right after the budget, but we're going to introduce legislation that would create the grant program, a statewide accessory dwelling unit grant program, an income tax credit to subsidize the rent and the property tax credit. So we need to give local governments the authority to be able to do that. Okay. And if the housing fund bill passes, that it would be legal for them to be able to do that also. So
because I hear that a lot. I hear that from everybody in the community because just as well as I do, it's not great for a small community when the teachers, the police officers, the government workers are not involved in the community and they go home to their own community at the end of the night.
Yeah, you and I are, we're quite a distance apart in age, but when I went to school at Pearson High School, and I know you went to school, and you're from Amagansett, you went to school here too. But when I was in school, my teachers lived in the community, and it's hard for teachers to do that now. It's hard for hospital workers. It's hard for people who live on Main Street to live in the community. So we need to provide these incentives to people to be able to afford to do that. The other thing is we're talking about monetary incentives, but we also need to do things. We need to provide resources to people I had somebody, write me about accessory apartments. They didn't know that Sag Harbor Village already had a law that permitted accessory apartments. So there needs to be an outreach program. We need to let people know, number one, that, this is an option, and that, towns and villages are open for business. We need an expedited application process. We need technical assistance for people that want to apply, so they don't have to spend an excessive amount of money hiring an engineer or an architect. Maybe there's pre-approved plans that we can provide, that if you do these things, you're going to get a fast approval. And you mentioned the thing with septic systems also. The towns have grants for septic systems also, but an expedited process for the septic systems too.
Yeah, and that's why I'm doing this affordable housing show. Is there are misconceptions, there are blatant lies, and then there's also just misunderstanding and not knowing. I want people to be able to understand what is available, what isn't. I want people to understand accessory dwelling units, the community preservation and community housing funds, and and that's why I'm doing this, is to have people from you to people who've been displaced, to people who I'm talking next week to someone over at Martha's Vineyard who works on housing there and affordable housing there, because they're a community very much like ours. I want to see how other people are doing things as well. We are running a little short on time here. I would love to ask you, though, any other thoughts that we didn't talk about that you would like to put out about affordable housing?
Well, yeah, well, two things I probably conclude with. One is, what we didn't mention that I want to mention is that when we're defining, people that would be eligible, obviously people that live and work here, we're really targeting. But when we wrote the definitions for this, we also, we're defining who is a resident, it's also people that have lived here before but aren't living here now, haven't lived here in the last 5 years, because we want also to make eligible people that had to leave, to give them the opportunity to come back. And I'd say
that's awesome.
The last thing that we didn't get to talk about that I'll finish with is that government can't do this all by itself. Government has to be a positive force. And we talked about some of the ways through the fund and incentives, how they can do that. But I think it's going to require partnerships, public-private partnerships, employee housing. We need to be working with the agricultural community. We need to be working with the hospitality community, restaurants and the hotels, and the biggest employers like the hospital and the school districts. East Hampton School District had a great meeting on affordable housing a couple of months back. So I think it isn't just government. We all have to kind of work together, bring what we can bring to the table. And I think if we meld it all together, we can finally make a difference in this.
Yeah, and that's what that's what I'm starting to get passionate about. I've really gotten into this topic for the last 6 months or so. I've learned a lot, and I can also tell you, one common theme I notice is, who is this affecting the most? And it's my generation. It's the kids in school right now that don't even recognize they're not going to be able to afford a house here unless they make it big. I'm trying to create awareness to everybody from all ages that this is a legitimate crisis out here.
Yeah, I would agree with you that it affects your generation more than any, because it affects a basic decision that you should have, which is whether or not you want to stay in your hometown. You may not, but you should at least have the option of being able to do that. But it affects you and your generation, disproportionately, but it affects all of us.
Yeah.
If we can't house the next generation of firefighters or nurses or teachers, or even for those that are here as a here on a seasonal basis, if we can't house the people that provide services in the community, it's going to be a lesser community for all of us.
Yep. And well, Fred, we are a little bit out of time here, but I will have you on again. We could talk about updates when you're way less busy over. I know you're up in Albany a lot this month, but we can have you on in a month or two, and we'll talk about updates that you may have. And we are planning on having a LTV hosted affordable housing forum. I know Legislator Fleming is going to be involved with that, so I'm hoping I can get you involved with that as well.
Yeah, we would look forward to it, and I'd love to give you an update as as we get closer to the referendum for the community housing fund, and I'll be able to report on how we're making out with accessory dwelling unit incentives.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening and watching the All In Affordable Housing Show here at LTV. I'm Matt Lownes with Assemblyman Fred Thiele. Thank you so much. Have a great day.